The first time Ruth Talbot laid hands on the cowboy, he was falling sideways out of a saddle, blood running dark through the dust, while the bay gelding fought not to crush him under its own panic. Harlan Voss stood on the porch of the boarding house with one boot hooked on the rail and said, smooth as warm oil, leave him. Any fool riding in at that hour bleeding from the ribs has earned what found him. Ruth never answered him when he used that voice. Not in 6 months. Not when he pushed her wages into next week, then the next month, then the next season. Not when he turned her late husband's burial bill into a chain around her ankle and called it fairness. But that evening, with the smell of rainless lightning in the air and the horse rolling white around the eyes, she did not look at Harlan at all. She went straight to the bay, caught the bridle under the bit, and laid her palm flat against the animal's sweating neck. Easy now, she said. It was the tone that did it. Not soft. Not frightened. Certain. The gelding shuddered once, then stood. The cowboy hit the ground on one knee instead of his head. Ruth caught him under the arm before the rest of him followed. He was heavy with the dead weight of a man trying not to lose consciousness. Dust stuck to the blood soaking his shirt. He smelled of horse leather, iron, and 3 hard days in the saddle. He lifted his head just enough for her to see his eyes. Gray, clear, in spite of the pain. Don't let him touch the saddlebag, he said, and then he folded into her hands like the last strength had gone clean out of him. If you're settling in with us tonight, wherever you are, say hello in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. There is something right about a Western traveling by lamplight from one quiet home to another. Then Ruth did the second thing Harlan Voss had not told her to do. She dragged the wounded stranger over the threshold of his own house. The front room of the Talbot boarding house had once been hers and Owen's pride. Back before drought, fever, and debt thinned it down to one woman working every room from stove to wash basin. Now the wallpaper peeled in one corner. The floorboards knew every tired foot she owned, and the supper stew had been stretched with so much barley that it barely remembered the taste of beef. Still, the place was clean. Ruth saw to that. Brass polished, sheets boiled, floors scrubbed with lye water until the pine lifted in the air. People could live poor, in her view. There was no law against poor, but there was no reason to live mean. She got the cowboy onto the long dining table because it was the widest thing in the room. Aunt Della, the laundress, appeared from the back hall with her gray hair pinned up by the same sewing needle she used for hems. Well, Aunt Della said, squinting at the stranger. He's too handsome for good news. Boil water, Ruth said. The old woman went at once. Outside, Boots crossed the porch. Harlan came in without haste, hat still on, spurs dry despite the deepening dusk. He owned the feed store, the freight contract, half the creek land west of town, and the sheriff's better opinion besides. He was the sort of man who never lifted his voice because the room always bent toward him before he had to. He glanced once at the table, once at the blood, then let his eyes settle on Ruth. If he dies on my floorboards, that comes out of what I owe you. It was such an ordinary cruelty that for a moment the room went still around it. Ruth slid a pair of shears beneath the man's shirt and cut upward through blood-stiff cloth. You'll need to owe me first. Aunt Della made a sound into her apron that might have been a cough and might have been a laugh. Harlan's mouth flattened. Careful. Ruth did not look up. Under the torn shirt, the wound sat high under the ribs where a bullet had burned through instead of buried deep. Lucky, if a thing that tore flesh open could be called lucky. The skin around it was hot. Too hot. He had ridden with fever already climbing him. Fetch Tomas, she said. The stable boy came running in almost before the words were done. Tomas was 14, all elbows and hungry height. With a split lower lip he worried with his teeth whenever grown folks were lying. He hovered by the table, staring. Take that saddle off the bay, Ruth said, and bring me the left bag. The left one only. Harlan stepped between them. The bag stays where it is. The boy froze. Then the man on the table moved one hand. Not fast, not strong, just far enough for the grip of the revolver under his coat to show. Even half-conscious, he said, Boy does what she told him. Tomas fled so fast the screen door banged hard enough to rattle the crockery shelf. Harlan looked at the gun, then at Ruth. You've brought trouble into my house. No, she said, cleaning blood away with a rag steeped in hot water. Trouble was already here. His face did not change. That was the dangerous thing about Harlan Voss. Anger in lesser men came on like weather. In him it went inward, colder and quieter, like a creek freezing from the bottom up. 6 months, he said. That's how long you've eaten under my roof on my credit. Ruth packed the wound with clean cloth. The cowboy clenched his jaw, but made no sound. 6 months, Harlan went on. Since your husband's debts became mine to carry. I've shown patience that would shame a saint. That was how he told the story. Not that Owen Talbot had died hauling Harlan's freight through an early blizzard because Harlan would not release the money already owed. Not that the doctor was paid late and the coffin later. Not that the boarding house deed had been signed over with Ruth's hands still shaking from burial. Harlan told it as charity. Rich men often did. Tomas returned with the saddlebag, breathing hard. Ruth took it without opening it, slid it beneath the table, and went back to the wound. You ain't even curious? The cowboy asked her through his teeth. I'm busy keeping you alive. For the first time, one corner of his mouth moved. By the time the bullet wound was cleaned and stitched, night had settled fully over Bitter Creek. The wind scraped sand against the windows. Men ate in the dining room with their hats low and their talk careful, because nothing shuts mouths faster than a rich man staying late in a poor house. Ruth carried plates, poured coffee, cut bread. She moved the way she always moved, without wasted motion, without complaint, with the kind of economy grief teaches a body when it has no extra strength to spend. Only once did she glance toward the back room where the stranger slept. Harlan saw it. When the last boarder had gone upstairs and the lamps were turned low, he met her by the kitchen doorway. What's his name? He hasn't offered one. That bag. No. He smiled then. Slow. Neighborly, almost. I could square your wages tonight. The words landed harder than any slap. For one shaming second, Ruth saw it in her mind as clear as Sunday sunlight. A small purse heavy enough to breathe on. Aunt Della paid proper. Flour bought before the barrel showed bottom. Tomas in boots without holes. Owen's headstone finally lettered instead of blank. All she had to do was hand over a bag she had not even opened. Harlan watched the thought cross her face. Men like him could want the way wolves smell blood. 6 months, he said again. Cash in your hand. All for a saddlebag that doesn't belong to you. Ruth looked past him at the stove where the banked coals glowed red through the grate. Then she looked at his clean collar, his gold watch chain, the ring on his small finger. She thought of Owen's cracked hands, of the empty envelope in the flour tin where wages should have been, of a dying stranger making one request before he trusted darkness. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough to make him lean in. Then I reckon you want it too badly for me to give it. Whatever lived behind Harlan's eyes hardened all at once. The open hand struck her so fast, Aunt Della gasped from the sink. Ruth hit the pantry door with one shoulder. The copper taste filled her mouth. She straightened before the pain had finished blooming. From the back room came the click of a revolver being cocked. The cowboy stood in the doorway barefoot and pale as paper, one hand braced on the frame, the other holding the gun low and steady. Blood had already begun to seep fresh through the bandage at his side, but his arm did not waver. Step away from her, he said. No one in that kitchen moved. Even Harlan seemed to understand that the room had tipped and could not be set right again. The thing Ruth had avoided for 6 months by swallowing anger, by lowering her eyes, by making herself smaller than her hurt. It was here now, breathing in the same air as all of them. The old silence was gone. Harlan adjusted his cuff as if nothing at all had happened. You don't know where you are, son. The cowboy's gaze never left him. I know exactly where I am. That was the moment Ruth's life split in two. The long season she had endured, and the one she would have to survive. By morning the whole town knew there was a wounded gunman at the Talbot house, a woman finally speaking back, and trouble sitting down to breakfast in Harlan Voss's own chair. The stranger's name was Gabriel Holt. He gave it over bacon and black coffee, sitting stiff-backed at the end of Ruth's table in one of Owen's old shirts. He was lean in the shoulders, sun-marked, a little older than 30, with the look of a man who had spent more nights outdoors than in. Not handsome in any vain sense. Handsome the way weathered timber is handsome, used hard, held up anyway. Tomas liked him at once because the man thanked Ruth for the coffee before he tasted it. Aunt Della liked him because he ate what was put in front of him and did not ask foolish questions while a woman was working. Ruth did not decide whether she liked him. She was too busy measuring risk. What was in the bag? She asked when they were alone. Gabriel wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. Proof. Of what? That Harlan Voss has been buying land in silence with money that never belonged to him. The room seemed to narrow. He reached under the table and pulled the oilskin bundle free. Inside lay a red-covered ledger, 3 folded county papers, and a packet of receipts tied with black thread. I rode to Laramie and back for certified copies, he said. Got jumped 10 miles out. Lost 1 horse. Kept the papers. You work for the law? No. For yourself? His eyes met hers then, and she saw the wear in them. Not the wound. The older thing. I work, he said, for a little sister I got back too late to help. Ruth said nothing. He looked down at the ledger. She was in service at a hotel south of Rollins when I was younger and dumber, and sure a man could leave for 1 season and fix everything with money when he came back. By the time I got there, she'd worked herself sick and died owing board she never should have been charged. His thumb rested on the red cover. Since then, I pay attention when a man grows rich on women who don't complain. There was no self-pity in it. That was what made it land. Ruth picked up one of the receipts. Her own name stared back at her in ink. Paid in full, it said. 6 months' wages settled. Only it was not her hand. Not even close. You can read books? Gabriel asked. She looked up once, sharp enough to cut. Can you? The corner of his mouth moved again. Fair. She laid out the papers one by one. Entry after entry. Names she knew. A widow charged for flour never delivered. Tomas's dead father listed as having drawn wages 2 months after burial. 2 drovers marked paid, though Ruth remembered both cursing at supper over empty pockets. Her own false receipt. Owen's freight charges doubled after his death. How long have you known? Gabriel asked softly. Known. She let out one short breath. Long enough to recognize his lies by the shape of them. Not long enough to prove one. That was the truth of her. Not blind. Never blind. Just trapped between knowing and being able to do anything useful with it. Outside, a wagon rattled over stones. From the upstairs hall came the cough of a boarder and the creak of a bed rope. The world kept going, even with a wicked man's account book lying open on the kitchen table. Gabriel rested his forearms there, wincing once at the pull in his side. I can ride the papers to the circuit judge. Harlan owns the sheriff. The judge is in Laramie. That's a long road between here and help. He studied her then with an attention that made her want to step back and stand still at the same time. You've been standing in the middle of wrong so long you don't even call it by name anymore. The remark should have angered her. Instead it tired her. When you ask a man for your due 6 months running, she said, and 6 months running he makes you feel troublesome for needing it. After a while you stop asking out loud. Gabriel was quiet. Then he said, people like Voss make a habit of charging good folks rent for their own decency. That line sat between them a long while. It was nearly noon when Harlan came back, this time with Sheriff Pettis beside him. Pettis was a fleshy man whose collar always looked half a size too tight, and when he lied he rubbed 2 fingers under it like truth had gone and choked him. He stood in Ruth's dining room and cleared his throat. Morning, Mrs. Talbot. It's afternoon, she said. He glanced at Harlan before continuing. I hear you're harboring a suspect wanted for questioning. Gabriel sat at the table with one hand resting easy by his cup. Question away. Harlan folded his gloves carefully. A freight clerk was found beaten outside Laramie. Papers missing. Horse stolen. Looks poor for a man arriving here shot and secretive. That horse out there is mine, Gabriel said. You've a bill of sale? Gabriel smiled without warmth. You've a conscience? Pettis coughed again. Ruth set down the pan she had been drying. If you mean to take him, bring a warrant. Harlan turned to her in perfect astonishment. Ruth, you of all people know what gratitude looks like. For 6 unpaid months? She asked. I'm learning. It was a small thing to say. Small and plain. But Tomas, listening from the doorway, stared at her like he had just watched a church bell answer back. Pettis did not have a warrant. He had only Harlan's money and the town's long habit of bending. So they left with a warning instead. By evening the warning had grown teeth. Men rode past the boarding house twice, slow enough to count windows. Lyle Mercer at the store wiped the same bare patch of counter until the wood shone and would not meet Ruth's eyes when she came for sugar on credit. Ezra Boone, the blacksmith, tapped a horseshoe against his knee and muttered, storm's moving, though the sky above was clear. Aunt Della found the back gate unlatched. Tomas swore there had been no stray dogs in the yard, yet scraps had been thrown there like someone was testing how easily the animals could be roused. It was not only threat. It was preparation. That night, Gabriel sat on the porch steps while Ruth pegged sheets under a violet sky streaked with dry heat. The cottonwoods along the creek whispered like old women sharing grief. "You can still walk away," he said. She snapped one final sheet to the line. "To where?" "Anywhere not here. My husband built this porch with green lumber and bad language. Aunt Della's got nowhere that isn't mine. Tomas eats because I stand over a stove. Walking away sounds simple only to people not carrying anybody." Gabriel bowed his head a fraction. "Fair." She came down the steps with the empty basket. "And you?" He looked toward the road west. "There's a livery in Fort Collins would give me work if I asked. Couple ranches north of Casper, too. Men remember me kind. But," he turned his hat in his hands, "but there's a thing in me that can't stand leaving a woman to a man like Voss, and then explaining to myself later why I had to." For a moment neither spoke. Then Ruth said, "You ain't him." "No," Gabriel answered. "But I know what it costs to come back too late." There it was. The wound under the wound. If you were sitting on that porch with them, with the evening cooling down and the smell of soap still in the sheets, what would you have done? Would you have trusted a half-healed cowboy carrying papers and promises? Or would you have hidden whatever hope you had left and prepared to fight alone? Tell me that in the comments, because there are honest hearts on both sides of that question. Before dawn, Gabriel made his choice. Ruth woke to the sound of leather pulled carefully across wood. She found him in the stable with the bay saddled and the red ledger wrapped tight in oilskin beneath his coat. Tomas held the lantern. The boy's split lip was white with worry. "You said the judge is in Laramie," Gabriel said. "I can make it if I start now. Harlan will have riders on the road." "I know. And if Pettis meets you first?" "I know that too." The horse stamped. Outside, the sky was still iron gray, the hour before birds. Ruth reached into her apron pocket and drew out 3 folded scraps of flour sack. Figures covered them in a neat, tight hand. Gabriel looked up. "I copied what I could from his office these last months," she said. "Nighttime, when I came in to bank the stove and he'd left the books open. I didn't think I could use it. Maybe you can." He took the scraps like a man receiving something sacred. "You've been keeping tally. I've been surviving." His hand closed over the cloth pieces. Then he said the foolish thing only an honest man would risk saying. "I'll come back." Ruth almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. Promises had put too many graves in her life. "Best don't make words expensive unless you mean to pay for them," she said. His gaze did not move from hers. "I mean to." He rode out 5 minutes later, the bay's hooves soft in the dirt, and Ruth stood in the stable door watching until horse and rider were nothing but shadow swallowed by dawn. Then she turned and went to make breakfast for men who had already decided what sort of story they were going to tell about her. By noon it had begun. A notice was nailed to her porch post declaring Gabriel Holt wanted for theft and violent assault. Harlan's seal at the bottom. Pettis's signature beside it. 2 riders waited across the street where they could be seen and not challenged. Boarders paid for 3 days and left by supper. Lyle Mercer refused more credit. A woman from the next farm overcrossed herself when passing Ruth in town, as if unpaid wages and disobedience might be catching. Harlan arrived mid-afternoon wearing a fresh vest and carrying a rolled paper. "Sign," he said, placing it on her kitchen table. Ruth read it once. It stated that all debts between Harlan Voss and Ruth Talbot were settled, that she had willingly worked for room and board, and that any claims to wages were false, malicious, and punishable by law. No. His smile was patient enough to sicken her. Read the second page. The second page was the boarding house deed, or what remained of it. Harlan had arranged the bank note so that one missed payment, one he himself had engineered, would put the property fully in his hands by week's end. "A woman alone," he said, strolling to the window. "No wages. No credit. Harboring a fugitive. I dislike ugliness, Ruth, but I don't fear it. Sign, and I let you stay on as housekeeper under kinder terms than another man might offer." She folded the paper once and set it back down. "You mean slave without the bother of chains." His eyes cooled. "Words like that get people hurt. Seems like silence does too." He moved faster than she expected. One hand on her jaw, thumb pressing hard enough to bruise. "You have mistaken tolerance for weakness." Pain flashed white behind her eyes. Still she did not flinch. That, more than defiance, angered him. A bottle shattered in the pantry. Tomas stood there frozen, vinegar soaking his boots. Harlan released her, and turned with a smile already rebuilt. "Boy," he said. "Careless." Tomas nodded too fast. "Yes, sir." But Ruth saw what the boy had seen. The open office door beyond the dining room. Harlan's desk, drawer not fully shut. Red leather inside. Another ledger. He had kept the original closer than anyone guessed. All evening the idea burned in her like swallowed spirits. At dusk, Aunt Della took Tomas upstairs, and Ezra Boone drifted in through the back, tapping a shoe against his knee. "He'll burn you out before he loses face," the blacksmith said without preamble. Ruth looked at him. "You know that." "I know men who smile with their hands clean." Ezra glanced toward the window. "Also know there's two of his boys behind the feed shed with kerosene." The world narrowed to one hard line. Ruth set down the ladle. "Can you get Della and Tomas across the creek?" Ezra nodded once. "And if I ask more?" His eyes, dark and steady, met hers. "Depends if it's foolish." "It'll be necessary," she said. When full dark came, Ruth waited until the riders behind the shed shifted and laughed low among themselves. Then she crossed the office with the lamp in one hand and Owen's old revolver in the other. She had never liked guns. They solved too many things in favor of whichever fool was quicker. But Owen had taught her the weight of one and the way fear changes when steel sits in your palm. Harlan's desk drawer stuck halfway. She pulled harder. Inside lay the original ledger, the county tax notices, 3 signed notes, and a cloth purse heavier than any 6 months of honest wages had ever felt. Ruth took the papers, left the money. Even then, with everything wobbling toward ruin, she could not bear to give him a story about theft. Voices outside. Closer. She blew out the lamp, slipped through the pantry, and nearly collided with Harlan in the rear hall. For one impossible second, they stared at each other in the dark. Then he smelled the oilskin in her hands and understood. "After her," he warned. Ruth ran. Not pretty, not graceful. 40 years old, apron strings snapping loose, skirts caught up in one fist, lungs ripping at smoke before the smoke had even started. She hit the back door as flame licked across the stable wall. Kerosene. Ezra had been right. Tomas shouted from somewhere beyond the yard. Horses screamed. Ruth veered toward the rain barrel and shoved the ledger bundle under the floating layer of dipper water, down between the bucket and the side where shadow hid everything. Then a hand caught her shawl from behind and yanked. She went backward into the dirt. Harlan loomed over her, fire throwing his face red and black by turns. "Give it here." "I don't have it." He kicked the rain barrel. Water sloshed out, but the bundle stayed hidden below the dark. One of his riders yelled that the stable roof was catching. Harlan hauled Ruth up by the arm and dragged her across the yard toward the tack room. "Then you can watch it burn until you remember." He flung her inside and dropped the bar. Outside, flames ran up dry timber with the hunger of things long planned. Smoke thickened at once. Through the crack under the door, she could see orange working the dirt. Ruth coughed, pressed her apron to her mouth, and looked wildly around the little room. Harness pegs. A broken currycomb. A rusted nail keg. One narrow window too small to climb. Somewhere beyond the fire, hoofbeats thundered over hard ground. Miles away at Willow Creek Crossing, Gabriel Holt had just hauled himself out of ambush. He had seen Pettis's men too late. One club to the shoulder, one shot wide in the dawn. He gave them the horse and kept the papers stuffed inside his boot because hard lessons had finally taught him that a man never hides the important thing where another man expects honor to keep him from being searched. He was limping through cottonwoods when he saw smoke over Bitter Creek. For half a heartbeat, he stood still. Then every memory he had of being too late rose up and put a knife to his ribs. By the time he reached the south field, he was not riding back to Ruth Talbot anymore. He was running. He hit the yard with Ezra Boone at his shoulder and Tomas behind them, crying that Miss Ruth was in the tack room. The stable had become a wall of flame. Men shouted. Horses battered their stalls. Aunt Della stood by the fence, hair fallen loose, cursing like a riverboat hand. Gabriel did not think. Thought is for later, for regrets and stories and graves. He wrapped a wet horse blanket over his head, took one breath that tasted of mud and ash, and went through the smoke. The bar on the tack room door burned his hands. He lifted it anyway. Ruth staggered toward him blind with smoke, one arm over her mouth, the other striking empty air for something solid. He caught her around the waist just as the rafters above cracked, like rifle fire. "Easy," he said, though nothing about the world was easy. "I got you." She made one sound. Not a sob. Not his name. Just the sound a body makes when it has been alone too long and suddenly isn't. They burst out into night and sparks. The next half hour came in pieces. Tomas dragging tack clear. Ezra cutting stall ropes. Aunt Della beating sparks from Ruth's skirt with both hands while insulting Harlan's parentage to heaven. Gabriel hauling one gelding after another into the yard until the last horse reared and almost crushed him, and Ruth, coughing blood into her palm, stepped straight to its face. "Ranger," she said. The terrified roan blew hard, hooves striking. Ruth laid both hands against its cheeks. "Not tonight." The horse settled. In the firelight, Gabriel watched it happen and understood something simple and immense. This woman had been holding chaos steady with her bare hands for so long no one remembered to call it strength. Harlan was gone by the time the roof fell in. So was the ledger from his desk. The one under the rain barrel remained where Ruth had hidden it. Ezra led them all to his lined shack by the creek because the boarding house was smoke and cinders, and because no one trusted the dark with Harlan Voss still moving inside it. The shack was one room, one cot, one cracked basin, and a stove that drew badly. It might as well have been a palace for all the safety it offered. Rain never came, but the night turned cold after fire the way grief does after anger. Aunt Della and Tomas slept wrapped in horse blankets by the stove. Ezra took first watch outside with a shotgun across his knees. Ruth sat on the cot, while Gabriel cleaned the burn along her forearm with water heated in a blackened kettle. His own shoulder had gone stiff from the ambush. Blood still marked one sleeve where the earlier wound had opened again. Neither had much left to spare. Both spent it carefully. The shack smelled of pine smoke, scorched wool, and coffee boiled too long. "You came back," Ruth said at last. Gabriel's hand paused against her wrist. "Said I would. Most men don't know what their word weighs." He met her eyes. "I know. That's why I came running." The quiet after that was not empty. It held things. Ruth looked down at the strip of clean cloth he was binding around her arm. "Owen used to say a house can be rebuilt if the kitchen table survives." Full thing to say. Table don't mean much without the people. "Did you love him?" Gabriel asked. "Yes." The answer came easy. The next part didn't. "He was gentle," she said. "That ain't small in a hard country. But gentle men get asked for one more trip, one more favor, one more risk. Folks like Harlan count on it." Gabriel tied off the bandage. Cruel people have a way of making ordinary kindness feel like a debt. Ruth let out a breath that might have been half a laugh and half a breaking. "There it is. That's exactly it." He sat back against the wall, careful of his side. The lantern between them gave off a low amber tremble. Outside, the creek moved over stones with the patient sound of something older than men and their greed. "My sister Clara," he said, "used to leave the best part of her supper on the windowsill for strays. Every time. Couldn't stop herself. Man who owned that hotel charged her for kitchen scraps she'd already cooked." He rubbed his thumb over a worn silver thimble on a chain around his neck. "She died thinking she'd been troublesome." Ruth closed her eyes. "That's the crime of them," she whispered. "Not just what they take. How they make you ashamed for needing what was yours." Gabriel took the chain off and laid the thimble in her palm. It was tiny, warm from his skin, dented at the tip from years of honest work. "She sewed everything," he said. "Could mend a sleeve so neat the tear would forget itself. I've carried that because I didn't know what else to do with the part of me that failed her." Ruth curled her fingers around it. Then, after a moment's struggle with something private, she reached beneath her collar and pulled a thin leather cord free. On it hung Owen's old brass room key from the boarding house, worn smooth at the teeth. "He kept it after we bought the place," she said. "Said a man ought to carry one key that means home, just in case life gets foolish." She placed it in Gabriel's hand. "I reckon I'm tired of carrying all the dead by myself." His fingers closed over the key like he understood the size of the gift. When he spoke again, his voice was lower than before. "Ruth." She looked up. "There ain't a thing wrong with how much it hurt you." That line went through her cleaner than comfort would have. Because comfort often lies. Truth does not have to. She leaned forward then, not into his arms exactly. Not yet, but into the space where she no longer had to stand alone. His forehead rested against hers. The lantern hissed softly. Somebody sleeping by the stove turned over and sighed. It was the smallest kind of closeness, and it felt large enough to rebuild a life inside. If this part of the story has found something tender in you tonight, that is exactly why these stories are told. Leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay with us. Folks who still believe quiet goodness matters deserve a place to gather. By dawn, the warmth between them had changed nothing and everything. Harlan was still free. The boarding house was still ash. The sheriff was still bought. But Ruth woke with Clara's thimble in one hand and a steadiness in her chest she had not felt since before Owen died. She sent Tomas with Aunt Della to Ezra's cousin 3 miles south. Then she walked back to the ruins with Gabriel beside her. The rain barrel still stood, scorched black on one side. Ruth reached into cold water up to the elbow and drew out the oilskin bundle. Gabriel laughed once under his breath, not from humor, but relief. "You are a wonder." "No," she said, squeezing water from her sleeve. "I'm just done being careful for the wrong people." Saturday was auction day in Bitter Creek. Everyone came. Farmers with 2 calves to sell. Teamsters. Widows buying flour. Men who had heard there might be trouble and hoped not to miss it. Harlan liked public things. Public things made power feel like proof. He stood on the platform outside the feed store in a cream vest, one hand hooked through his coat front, greeting the town as if no fire had walked the night. Sheriff Pettis lingered close by, sweating under that murderous collar. While Mercer had come out from the general store and was wiping the same patch of wood on the hitch rail with a rag. Even from across the street, Ruth could see his shame. The murmur began before she reached the square. She did not wear mourning black. She wore the dark blue dress she had kept boxed since Owen's funeral, smoke smell still clinging in its hem. Gabriel walked half a pace behind and to the left because he understood something about witness. Ezra Boone came on her right, silent and broad as a gatepost. Behind them trailed 3 drovers, Mrs. Bean from the Creek Farm, and old Mr. Clegg whose hands shook, but whose memory for unpaid freight dates had not. Communities are slow to brave things. But once they start, they can surprise themselves. Harlan saw the ledger under Ruth's arm, and all the pleasantness left his face. "Well," he called from the platform, loud enough for the crowd. "The fugitive returns, and with my former housekeeper." How dramatic. Ruth climbed the steps. Not fast, not timid, just climbed them and stood where everybody could see the bruise fading yellow along her jaw. "Harlan Voss," she said, and because she did not shout, everybody had to quiet down to hear. "You owe wages to the living and the dead." A ripple went through the crowd. He spread his hands. "Grief has upset you." "No," she said. "Numbers have." She opened the red ledger. For 6 months Ruth Talbot had made herself small enough to survive. That morning she made herself plain enough to be believed. There is a difference. She read the entries cleanly. Names, dates, amounts. Flour charged twice. Burial fees charged 3 times. Teamsters paid on paper who had never seen the money. Tomas's father listed drawing wages after the day Ruth herself had washed his body for burial. Mrs. Bean's Creek parcel purchased through a proxy using funds skimmed from labor accounts. Her own false receipt. Harlan laughed once. Too sharp. A woman can't wave a book and call it law. Ruth lifted the forged receipt with her name on it. No, but a woman can recognize her own hand. She turned it so all could see. "This says I signed in August. I burned my right palm in June. Couldn't hold a pen proper till September. Ask the doctor. Ask Della, who wrapped it. Ask your own cook, if you haven't lied her away already." Murmurs thickened. Pettis stepped forward. "That proves nothing." Gabriel took out the certified county papers then. "These might." He handed them to Lyle Mercer first, not the sheriff. Lyle read 2 lines, swallowed, and for once in his life lifted his voice toward a richer man. "These are clerk stamped," he said. "Land transfer through Elias Dunn Holdings." He looked up slowly. "Elias Dunn is dead." A laugh, shocked and ugly, broke from somewhere in the crowd. Mrs. Bean pushed to the front, cheeks red with fury. "That dead man bought my creek lot? Funny, seeing as I begged you for 1 more month, and you told me the buyer was respectable." "Stand down," Harlan snapped. Ruth kept reading. When she reached Owen's freight entries, the world narrowed again. One last run added after the storm warning. Double charges for axle and mule feed. Burial cost padded by the same amount as the missing wages. She closed the book and looked at Harlan fully. "You didn't just steal from him," she said. "You made his goodness the means of robbing him." Even then Harlan tried charm. "People in this town have eaten because I kept contracts running. You think they'll turn on me over arithmetic? No, Ruth said. Over memory. Then one by one. Because truth is easier spoken after the first brave voice, they did. A drover said he'd never been paid cash, only promises. Mr. Clegg named 2 freight runs missing from his books. Aunt Della, who had arrived with Tomas after all, shouted from the back that Harlan charged widows for lamp oil they brought themselves. Ezra Boone produced a note from Pettis threatening to jail him for unpaid taxes already settled. Tomas held up the split lip he'd gotten from one of Harlan's riders the night of the fire and said, in a boy's shaking voice, "He told me poor folks ought to learn who owns the matches." Pettis reached for Gabriel then, maybe to stop the tide, maybe because cowardice often pretends it is duty. Gabriel caught the sheriff's wrist, twisted once, and the revolver fell into the dust. That was the end of authority. Harlan drew his own gun and backed toward the hitch rail, grabbing Tomas by the collar on the way. The crowd broke apart. "Drop the book," he barked at Ruth, gun pressed hard to the boy's temple. "Or I'll leave his brains on Main Street." Everything in Ruth went cold and clear. The horse tied behind Harlan was Ranger, the roan from the stable, the one she had steadied in fire. Smoke had singed one ear. He rolled one uneasy eye at the gun's flash. Ruth took one step sideways. Not toward Harlan, toward the horse. "Ranger," she said. Harlan jerked the boy tighter. "Don't." Ruth ignored him. "Easy now." The roan knew her voice. That was all. No miracle. No magic. Just all the small patient acts of care no one had counted while they were happening. Ranger sidestepped toward her, jerking the lead rope across Harlan's arm. Tomas twisted free on pure instinct. Gabriel lunged, hauling the boy away. Harlan fired once, wild. The shot shattered the auction bell. Then Ezra Boone hit him from the side like a falling gate. By the time the dust settled, Harlan Voss was on his face in the street with 3 men on his back, one arm bent under him, his cream vest gone gray with dirt. Pettis was kneeling beside the trough with Gabriel's knee between his shoulders. Women stood closer now than the men, and not one of them looked away. Harlan spat dust and rage. "You think this ruins me?" Ruth stepped down from the platform and stopped where he could see her shoes. Nothing fine. Polished black boots gone dull at the toes from 6 months of unpaid labor. "I know it does," she said. It did. Some endings happen with gun smoke. Some happen with signatures. By Tuesday, the county prosecutor was in Bitter Creek with 2 deputies and a stack of warrants thick as hymnals. Arson, fraud, forgery, false conveyance, wage theft, conspiracy with a law officer. Pettis lost his badge before noon and his freedom by supper. Harlan lost the feed store, the freight contract, the creek parcels, the boarding house claim, and every last decent word ever spoken in his favor. His assets were sold under court order. From that money, the labor accounts were settled first. Ruth received 6 months' wages. Owens withheld freight pay. The deed to the boarding house restored clear of Harlan's note, and enough besides to replace the roof with proper timber. Mrs. Bean got her creek lot back. Ezra Boone got his tax money returned with interest. Tomas got boots that fit and, by general agreement of the entire town, the right to tell his version of events whenever he pleased. Aunt Della got 3 new hairpins and declared them inferior to the sewing needle. As for Gabriel Holt, he was offered work by 3 ranchers before the week was out. He turned them all down. "I've had my fill of hired roads," he told Ruth, standing in the half-framed doorway of the rebuilding house. "If there's room here for a man who knows horses, can patch a roof crooked, and means what he says, I'd ask it." Ruth looked around at the fresh boards, the kitchen table Ezra had somehow salvaged from the fire, the morning light moving over dust motes like a blessing finally arriving late, but honest. "There's room," she said. He came to her slowly, the way decent men approach things they don't want to startle. "And for more than work." The answer was not young girl quick. It was woman true and earned. She touched the brass room, key still hanging now from his neck. "Best don't stay if you mean to leave." Gabriel laid his hand over hers. "Best don't ask if you don't already know." She smiled then, small but real. "I know." By first frost the new porch stood wider than the old one. Tomas had grown 2 more inches and one full opinion on every subject under heaven. Aunt Della still ruled the washroom like a frontier general. Travelers began choosing the Talbot house because the food was honest, the coffee strong, and the woman at the door looked a body in the eye as though their dignity had been set aside in advance and waiting for them. Some evenings Gabriel mended tack at the kitchen table while Ruth wrote figures in a clean ledger, every wage accounted for, every debt named exactly once. Sometimes their hands touched in passing, and neither hurried away from it. Sometimes nothing was said at all, because the best kind of peace does not require constant proof. In spring, when the cottonwoods leafed out silver green and the creek loosened itself from winter, a rider asked the boy at the stable who owned the house now. Tomas grinned and said, "Folks think it belongs to Ruth Talbot. Truth is, it belongs to whoever walks in tired and leaves feeling remembered." At supper that same night, with lamplight warming the new planked walls and Clara's thimble hanging beside Owen's brass key on the peg by the door, Ruth looked across the table at Gabriel and said, almost to herself, "Strange thing about home. Turns out it was never a place you earned, just a place where love quit keeping score." Beyond the porch, the evening lay soft over Bitter Creek, and the windows of the Talbot house shone gold against the blue dark like a promise that had finally been paid in full. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf seamstress sent away to a mountain sheep ranch because her brothers called her a burden, and the one-eyed rancher who learned her language before he ever asked her name.